Lord of the Oasis. Chapter 41, Forging a Path to Victory. Intimidation was an extraordinary item provided by the system to begin with. It served to weaken the enemy's morale, including those of the Jack Allen forces. The 50 retainer knights led by Hobson immediately cut into the flanks of the Jack Allens. The might from the charge of the handful of heavy cavalry units was comparable to that from over 1,000 infantry units. Around 40 to 50 Jack Allens were sent flying by the stout war horses charging into their midst. Their fine lances easily skewered the Jack Allens' bodies. As they continued to rampage among the Jack Allens, the knights drew their long swords. Any that had not been able to evade the knights' attacks in time, or those who simply froze in fear, were quickly slain by the knights on the spot. Cavalry units always had an edge over infantry units. Heavy cavalry units in the era of cold weapons were lauded as kings of land battles for their impressive capability to crush any other types of units. As such, the Jack Allens were thrown into utter chaos. After seeing their own instantly dropping dead left and right, and knowing that they were caught in a pincer attack carried out by human infantries in front and human cavalry units at the rear, the Jack Allens stopped resisting and started fleeing in panic. For Swadia. The infantry units on the street, who were all in a frenzy with bloodlust, continued to hunt down the Jack Allens before them. Kent also had his own cavalry force. The 17 desert bandits quickly emerged. Each one held a spear and skewered any Jack Allen that did not manage to flee in time. The desert bandits did not even bother to pull their spears out before bringing down their flanged maces onto the heads of those beast-like creatures. The Jackalan's skulls were cracked open. Crimson blood, which was mixed with grey brain matter, splattered everywhere. When it came to brutality and ferocity, there were times when humans were on par with beasts. The humans showed no mercy. In this battle, the survival of their species was on the line. The desert bandits charged forward with their horses. They paid no heed to their own safety as they blazed a trail for the infantry units behind them. They charged straight into the deeper parts of the Jack Allen forces. The desert bandits divided the already messed up formations of the Jack Allens. As they pushed through the tribe, it was as if they were slaughtering chicks. The ferocious primitive tribe members fled with only terror and fear in their minds. Ow! The Jack Allen chieftain swung its two-handed battle axe down onto the Jack Allens beside him, killing them on the spot. He wanted to stop his forces from crumbling. However, it did not matter how angry his howls were. The Jack Allens, which were feeling nothing but fear and terror by then, had no intention of staying on the battlefield. That was the fate of primitive forces fighting without any form of strategy. They quickly fell into panic and chaos once a crippling blow had been dealt. Furthermore, that red banner emblazoned with a golden lion continued to billow without wind. It cast formless waves onto the battlefield in the dark of night. Its effects continued to work at full force. The Jackalan's morale had practically been decimated to the point that was hardly any morale left. All of them fled quicker than before. Even though the Jack Allens had an overwhelming advantage in terms of numbers, all of them had been thrown into utter chaos and panic. They knew of nothing else at the moment but to run with their brethren around them. As they saw some of them were already running, more Jack Allens ran. The vicious cycle brought about by a herd mentality caused the Jack Allen forces to crumble. As he followed behind the desert bandits, Kent drew his short sword and held his banner high. The retainer knights, who seemed to be clad in blood-red linen robes, were seen causing terror among the Jack Allens not far away. They were covered in blood by then. Their red linen robes were stained with the blood of slain Jack Allens. In this battle, the value of an elite force was brilliantly displayed. Even Kent had grown envious of the retainer knights, who were still rampaging about. If only I had 50 Swadian knights under my command. He quickly rectified his thoughts. Even if he had 10 Swadian knights under his command, he would have been extremely happy. It would have allowed him to lead the low-level troop classes. They would have torn the Jack Allen forces apart, slaughtering the enemy to their heart's content without any restraint. Ow! Howls of anguish were heard somewhere in front of him. Kant narrowed his gaze forward and held tight on his intimidation banner. He looked rather serious. The howls had come from the Jack Allen chieftain. The chieftain swung his two-handed battle axe without any regard for the Jack Allens around him. He brought down 2 of the retainer knights' horses on the spot. The blood on the axe was a testament that those 2 knights' fate had taken a turn for the worse. A chieftain position was reserved for the strongest Jack Allen. The strongest Jack Allen before them wore mail armor and wielded a two-handed battle axe. He had especially terrifying combat prowess. He was so terrifyingly powerful that not even the retainer knights dared to get close to him. That Jack Allen chieftain's bloodshot eyes were focused forward. He howled in a frenzy as he charged at the retainer knights. The chieftain swung his battle axe with wild abandon. He brought down several retainer knights like a miniaturized windmill. That scene seemed to have restored some of the morale of the Jack Allens around him. **T. Kant frowned. If the Jack Allens had their morale restored, the chaos before them was likely to continue. It was especially so if they were to discover that the number of humans hunting them down was actually only a fraction of their forces in terms of numbers. At that time, those ferocious Jack Allens would have fiercely retaliated. Kant's forces, as well as the retainer knights would have quickly experienced what it was like to be brought down by overwhelming numbers. Lord Kant, I guess we need to take that guy down. The desert bandits, who were riding their horses in front of Kant, noticed Kant frowning. They continued thrusting with their spears and swinging their flanged maces, bringing down Jack Allens around them. Due to the might brought by all 17 of them, the Jack Allens around them were escaping left and right without any intention of fighting back. The Jack Allens were still in a panic and desperately trying to flee. All right, do you guys have any ideas? Kant nodded with a serious expression. Sure. The desert bandits answered affirmatively as they drew the javelins from on their backs. The javelins, which were comparable in length to that of a grown man's arm and crafted using fine wooden materials, had very pointy spearheads. They were stabilized by a weighty metal counterweight at the rear end. All of that made them very formidable throwing weapons. The desert bandits were also very well trained in the use of such weapons. Kant said in a low voice, "Take him out." The desert bandits lifted their pilums in place of a verbal answer before kicking the belies of their horses hard. A stinging pain was felt by the desert horses, causing them to immediately charge. All 17 of them formed a wall of horses. They trampled any Jack Allens that happened to get in their way. The desert bandits quickly closed in on the Jack Allen chieftain. They expertly threw their javelins, which they had raised beforehand, in full force at their target. Shoo! The sounds of projectiles tearing through the air were heard. The Jack Allen chieftain continued to madly swing about with his battle axe several feet away. Before he knew it, he soon felt a massive force hitting his back. Ow! The pain caused his eyes to become even more bloodshot. The 11 javelins penetrated his back, which was clad in mail armor. The spearheads, which had blood grooves, lodged deeply into his back muscles. It made the Jack Allen chieftain, who seemed strong and mighty, look like a hedgehog instead. His right arm, which was the arm wielding the battle axe, had 2 javelins lodged into it. The pain was so intense that he struggled to maintain a grip on the weapon. Howls were heard from his wolf-like head. His eyes quickly filled with murderous intent. He glared at Kent and the desert bandits behind him. The desert bandits switched back to their spears and flanged maces. Those were the people who threw javelins at him moments ago. However, he was able to do nothing but remember the moment. Shoo! A glitter of cold steel was seen as a long sword lacerated the throat of the Jack Allen chieftain. Sir Hobson charged at the chieftain with his sword in hand, which was sharp enough to easily tear through the chieftain's throat. It caused the chieftain, who looked strong and mighty, to fall to his knees holding his throat. The intimidation banner billowed in the breeze. The golden lion looked even more ferocious than before. The second effect was activated. Killing the enemy leader caused the enemy forces to be thrown into chaos. The Jack Allen forces had fallen into complete chaos by then. It was chaos of such a level that the Jack Allen forces suffered an utter defeat right there and then. The Jack Allens, which saw their chieftain falling to the ground, dropped their weapons and whimpered. There was only one thought on their minds by then: run. The further away they were able to get, the better. For Swadia, kill them all. The death of the Jackalan's leaders became a decisive turning point that determined the outcome of that battle. The soldiers charged as they shouted in a frenzy. They pounced on the fleeing Jack Allens with greater fervor since they no longer had anything to fear. The retainer knights galloped away on their war horses, killing any fleeing Jack Allens they were able to find around them. They wanted to make sure that the members of that primitive race being thrown into chaos was so thorough that there was no way for them to recover again. The entire place was filled with fleeing Jack Allens. It was quite ironic given that there were still at least 1,500 of them around. However, having lost the will to fight, they were of little difference than sheep waiting to be slaughtered. To Kant, his single largest threat in the Naran desert was that massive Jack Allen tribe. Now, under the glittering stars in the sky, they had completely lost the ability to fight him. The Jack Allens were reduced to little more than gravel to be stepped on. They were now a page in the history books. Chapter 42, Surplus Experience. The bright moonlight shining from above seemed to have been imbued with a chill that seeped deep into their bones. They were in the Oasis lookout within the Naran desert. The fighting at dusk had been intense, and it ended with the total collapse of the Jack Allen forces. The stench of blood remained thick in the air. It made the scene feel like a slaughterhouse. After all, it was a battlefield where fevered combatants had gone for each other's throats. Dead bodies were sprawled everywhere. Blood was in such abundance that it stained the sand beneath them red. The bodies belonged to beings who did not want to die. The yearning for life was still seen deep within their lifeless eyes. None could have afforded to pull punches on that battlefield. None could have afforded mercy for the enemy. Only victors were qualified to savor the brutality of a battle and be sorrowful over it. Losers deserved only to be buried and reduced to specks of dust in history. Kant knew that very well. If he had been on the losing side in that battlefield, not even the bodies left sprawling on the ground would have ended up being buried. Jack Allens were not averse to the notion of eating human flesh. To the members of that primitive race, fine, juicy human dead bodies were, to an extent, considered a delicacy to them. Jack Allens and humans were totally different races at the most fundamental levels. Winner takes all. Losers can shove it. Kant quietly muttered to himself. He had little to mourn over regarding that intense battle. He did not mind seeing more Jack Allens dead. On the contrary, he felt pity for all the Swadian troops who perished in that battle. It meant that his military force suffered a huge loss. The leader of the trade caravan did the accounting and made a report of the casualties. 100 Swadian peasants. 58 dead, 42 remained. 30 Swadian recruits. 24 dead, 6 remained. 35 Swadian militias. 16 dead, 19 remained. The loss was crushing. Kant's forces had suffered a devastating blow in the battle. It was bound to take quite a while for his forces to recover. Kant frowned hard when he saw the report. He took a deep breath to calm the intense frustration he felt deep down. He bitterly said, "The cost of 92 dead is steep." It was actually more than steep. More than half of his zero-level troop class was lost. His first and second-level troop classes were almost gone. It was a crushing blow that would significantly slow the development of Trondheim. After losing so many troops, Kant was not going to be able to organize an effective defense. After losing so many peasants, he was also unable to further develop his village. "Count your blessings, I guess." Kant sighed. He still felt grateful for the bright side of things. Although he had suffered huge losses, he had the system. It allowed him to recover some parts of the loss. "Ding, the enemy has been totally crushed after a bloody battle." Side quest, persistence in adversity is complete. Reward acquired, dinar x 1000, reputation x 500, honor x 1. Introduction, your bravery served to keep your forces going on the brutal battlefield. As a result, they were able to hold on to their beliefs and crush the brutal, merciless enemy forces in staggering numbers. Kant's reward was issued by the system through the dialog box. However, a new dialog box appeared before the one he was reading disappeared. Ding, you have acquired a proud victory due to having a battle in which you had been severely outnumbered. Evaluation acquired, epic victory. Acquired reputation x 100. Acquired honor x 1. That was the evaluation of the battle given by the system. The result was astonishing. Epic victory? Kant clenched his fists as his heart raced. It was quite a lovely surprise for him. It was especially so because he had acquired 2 honor. While he suffered considerable losses on the battlefield, have those 2 points for the prize draw in the mall allowed him to recover all of his losses. If he were really lucky, he could become even richer than that. After all, Kant had acquired the sacred intimidation banner through prize drawings. Suddenly, a dialog box from the system appeared yet again. It was a dialog box regarding troop classes. Ding, your forces have upgradable units. The battle was over. After the intense battle, his troops were finally able to continue getting upgraded. They could become troop classes with greater combat capacity. Open up the troop class page. He felt rather heavy deep down and took a deep breath. His upcoming actions greatly affected the strength of his forces. The dialog box from the system immediately opened, and the list was packed full of options. Upgradable troop class, Swadian Peasants x42. Spend 10 dinars each to upgrade to Swadian Recruit. Ding, you have surplus experience. Your forces can be upgraded consecutively. Upgradable troop class, Swadian Recruits x6. Spend 20 dinars each to upgrade to Swadian Militia. Ding, you have surplus experience. Your forces can be upgraded consecutively. Upgradable troop class, Swadian Militias x19. Spend 30 dinars each to upgrade to Swadian Footman / Swadian Skirmisher. Ding, you have surplus experience. Your forces can be upgraded consecutively. Upgradable troop class, Desert Bandits x17. Spend 25 dinars each to upgrade to Elite Desert Bandit. Ding, you have surplus experience. Your forces can be upgraded consecutively. Things happened as Kant had expected. After securing an epic victory in that battle, every single unit that lived managed to get upgraded. There was even surplus experience to be had. According to the system, they were able to be upgraded to further levels. All of that served as a testament to how much Kant gained from that one battle. Bagging a decisive victory fighting 2,000 invading Jack Allens had been incredibly difficult. One mistake could have led to them all ending up dead on the battlefield. Kant gulped. He browsed the troop class page. Well, the number of dinars required for upgrades seems rather steep. According to the available upgrades for his current forces, it required spending 1,367 dinars to get the upgrades. Worse still, that expenditure excluded further upgrades after that. Kant had no idea just how much surplus experience would have been left after upgrading them. Then again, he would not have had to worry about it in the first place. At the moment, the 1,367 dinars was a huge sum to Kant. He had acquired 500 dinars after selling the dates. He had spent 30 dinars recruiting one desert bandit. He next acquired 1,000 dinars by completing the Persistence in Adversity quest. With that added together, Kant currently had 1,470 dinars to spare. If he upgraded all of his remaining units in one go, Kant would be broke. It would have created a situation like how it had been before, where he could not afford to pay the upkeep for his forces in the following week. It was bound to put him in a very awkward position. There was no way he was able to proceed in that way. This is really a headache. He pinched at his brow hard. He had just secured a victory, yet he felt jaded all over. It felt as if all of his strength had been sucked out of his body. As he was thinking about what to do next, he heard hurried footsteps from behind. Captain Rowan, who had been fighting alongside the retainer knights before, approached Kant. He was also soaked in blood. He lowered his head and said with a rather complicated expression, "My lord, Sir Hobson and Scholar Hank wish to speak with you." "Yeah, noted." Kant nodded. Regardless of feelings, Kant was a baron, so Rowan's tone was polite and lacked the slightest bit of impatience in it. The presence of both Hobson and Hank was a testament to Kant's nobility. As a mere captain of the knights, Rowan's status made it such that he was unthinkable to offend Kant. Kant quickly went to the council hall, where the retainer knights were regrouping and tidying themselves up. When they were charging at the Jack Allans and dealing them a crushing blow, there had been many among those brave retainer knights who ended up injured. There had even been several among them who died during the battle. Kant went up and asked in a rather serious tone, "How are the casualties, Sir Hobson?" 6 were gravely injured, and 7 are dead, Sir Hobson replied. Kant's frown became even more pronounced as he apologized. "I'm sorry for getting you all in this mess, Sir Hobson. It was indeed him who got them in that mess. If it had not been for Kant, those retainer knights would not have had needed to come to the Oasis lookout and fight that many Jack Allans in the first place. It is the destiny of knights to die with glory on the battlefield." Sir Hobson shook his head and took a deep breath. He said, "It's a more memorable way to go dying in battle than to die of old age yet having accomplished nothing after all." He paused for a bit before turning around to look at Kant. His tone became rather secretive when he said, "It is indeed our mission to help solve your problems when we're out here. That was the other mission of ours, one that no one briefed us about or said out loud." "I don't quite understand." Kant frowned. "You are part of the Duke's bloodline." Scholar Hank walked out of the council hall with his cane and said, "I never believed for a second that someone of my status would have warranted an escort consisting of 50 retainer knights of the castle for protection, or that the expedition was little more than a common survey. I'm truly sorry." Sir Hobson had nothing to offer the scholar but an apology. "Don't be. I was able to guess what was going on." Scholar Hank smiled after shaking his head. In a lethargic tone, he said, "That's how it is with you nobles, and that's why I don't like mingling with you people." Both men knew that there was no need for more words after that. Kant frowned, recalling his high-born, convenient father Duke Cameron. "So, it's because of you," the scholar muttered to himself. Now that thing had been put in such a manner, everything made sense. "Baron Kant." Scholar Hank interrupted Kant's thoughts. "What is it, Master Hank?" Kant came to his senses again. The scholar said, "The Jack Allans have suffered a crushing blow. If everything goes well, they won't be attacking this place again for a very long time. As such, I'm preparing to leave this place." "Leave?" Kant was slightly baffled. "Yes, I'm thinking of leaving." Scholar Hank felt rather overwhelmed when he gazed at the faraway dunes. He shook his head and said, "The lost city is but a myth. I thought that Duke Cameron had been moved by my findings and finally decided to back my expedition. Come to think of it now, it was reckless to judge that the legends were true from nothing more than a single line in some book." Well, Kant opened his mouth but quickly found himself tongue-tied. Scholar Hank shook his head and wore a bitter smile. "I'm thinking of heading back. I can consider the expedition to have fulfilled my dreams." He sighed and quipped, "The lost city is but a myth after all. It was a renowned legend in the dukedom of Leo. Countless people throughout history had searched for it before. If there had indeed been clues out there, said clues would have probably long been found." Chapter 43, Part-Time Slave Trader. It was early dawn. People were seen getting busy in the Oasis lookout. The Swadians were diligently cleaning up the battlefield. They disregarded their fatigue as they went about cleaning up the village as quickly as possible. It was especially so with the bloody mess of dead Jack Allans. The bodies were of a top priority on the list of clean UPS to do. Temperatures in the desert were high. Once the bodies began to rot and seep into the soil, underground water reserves would have ended up contaminated. At the point, things would have taken a turn for the worse. The sun slowly rose, bringing the arrival of dawn. The battlefield had been completely cleaned up. More than 400 Jack Allen bodies were piled into a mound. That was the result of the previous night's battle. There were also more than 100 Jack Allens with their hands tied behind their backs located at the back of the houses. All of them hung their heads low in despair. That was also a result of the battle. Those Jack Allens had been taken as prisoners. The 19 Swadian militia member who managed to survive were keeping a close eye on the Jack Allen prisoners. They held on tightly to their hunting crossbows. If they dared to try anything funny, bolts loaded on the crossbows were ready to be unleashed on the prisoners. There was also the combat shovel, a weapon capable of penetrating armor with a single hit, being readied, waiting to crack open the skulls of the prisoners. Then again, no one else seemed to care much about those Jack Allen prisoners. Kant's allies, who had helped him win the battle the previous night, were getting ready to depart that morning. "It's time for us to leave, Baron Kant." Sir Hobson extended his hand and held Kant's hand tightly. "Thank you for providing us with breakfast and fresh water. May Edmund, the great god of war, watch over you and your lands." "Likewise." Kant nodded. Gratitude was seen in his eyes. He turned around and looked at Scholar Hank. In an apologetic tone, he said, "Master Hank, I do wish the expedition into the Naran Desert would have brought more than just regret for you." "It did." Scholar Hank shook his head and grinned. "I shall leave finding the lost city to my juniors." He lightly sighed. He seemed rather vexed as he rummaged through his clothes and handed a scroll over to Kant. "This is the sum of my research of the lost city from the Academy. I may never come to the desert again. Since you're the lord of the place, it would please me if you were to be able to find ruins, or at least some artifacts having anything to do with the lost city." "Thank you, Master Hank." Kant solemnly took the scroll. Kant was aware that the scholar's life work was contained within the scroll. He packed it away carefully and replied, "I shall treat it with care. I hope you can finish my work." Scholar Hank smiled and nodded. He looked as if a weight had been lifted off of his shoulders. He chatted with Kant for a bit before returning to his carriage. "Farewell, Baron Kant." Sir Hobson nodded before turning around and leaving with his retainer knights in tow. Those who were gravely injured were assisted by their peers. The dead retainer knights were strapped onto the war horses that served them. Both knight and horse were of a single entity. Even though they died on the battlefield, they needed to be brought home by others. That was where true honor lied. Captain Rowan was among those helping the severely injured retainer knights. After fighting such an intense battle, it was likely that Sir Hobson would vouch for him when they returned home. There was a possibility of a promotion waiting for him. Then again, none of that had anything to do with Kant. He had left the dukedom of Leo quite a while ago. Now, he was but a lesser lord in the Naran Desert. However, he still immediately recalled that father of his. At the thought of him, he sighed. He was puzzled at what was actually going on in his father's head. "He exiled me here, yet." He hung his head low and felt complicated emotions. "Why bother sending anyone to back me up out here?" That was what troubled him most. He had been living in that world for 16 years. It was inevitable that he would become attached to that world. It was even more so in the case of his father, the man who raised him. "Good morning, Lord Kant. You do not seem to be in the mood." A respectful greeting was heard from behind. Kant turned around and found the leader of the trade caravan from Revaden behind him. Kant grinned after nodding. "Good morning." He behaved more amicably to the leader. That man, whom he knew nothing about before, had participated in that battle the previous evening. He fought hard with his escorts and mercenaries. That changed Kant's opinion toward him. I do hope I'm not getting in the way of anything, my lord. The leader of the trade caravan behaved just as respectfully as he had always done. He did not let the merit of his help toward Kant get to his head. That was the way a person should have behaved. As a leader of a trade caravan going around towns and cities alike, he knew that very well. Is there anything you would need from me? Kant was able to sense the man's hesitation. The leader gulped and nodded. He said, well, it's like this, Lord Kant. I've seen that you have captured several Jack Allens from the battle last night. Do you have any thoughts about them? Kant was slightly startled. Instead of skirting the question, the leader nodded and hurriedly said, those Jack Allens look fit, and they seem to have some sense of reason still. I'm thinking that they would serve as decent labor for working in mines and forests, after they are tamed, of course. So. Kant knew there was something else. That was a specialty of the game. Captured troop classes were resources tradable using dinars. Selling them to slave traders would have been very profitable. That was considered to be one of the most important sources of dinars to players. I'd like to purchase the Jack Allen prisoners. The leader immediately said what was on his mind. I see. Kant grinned as he eyed the rather awkward expression on the leader. He looked at the faraway dunes and said, it never occurred to me that a trade caravan dealing with regular goods was into slave trade as well. It's a part-time job. The leader awkwardly lowered his head. Slave traders were not of good repute. In fact, they were considered a notorious bunch on the continent of Caradia. To Kant, who was in desperate need of money, it was a boon and one of the best things that could have happened to him at the moment. He had sold slaves back in the game. Currently, there was no way he was going to overlook this type of opportunity. As such, Kant asked without beating around the bush, how much are you offering for the Jack Allen slaves? Well, in this case, I'd offer 30 dinars for each prisoner. The leader gulped as he looked at Kant with rather fearful eyes. In full honesty, he added, I'm not a professional slave trader, so I'd only be able to evaluate and offer 30 dinars each. I do think that the actual price for each of those prisoners would be higher. 30 dinars, Kant muttered to himself. He turned around and said, we have a deal. According to prices in the game he played in his past life, even the lowliest of bandits would have been worth 35 dinars each. However, considering that the leader was the only buyer having any link to the system, Kant did not object to the offer. Besides, he still had to do business. Furthermore, those were dinars that he gained from doing nothing. Even if he were to only be given 10 dinars each, Kant would not have hesitated to sell the Jack Allens. He was unable to think of any decent ways to deal with the Jack Allen prisoners. If the leader of the trade caravan had not offered to buy them, his only way to deal with the prisoners would have been to slit their throats, throw them into the pile, and burning them down to ash. He did not need Jack Allen slaves. There are 142 Jack Allen prisoners. The leader flashed a beaming smile as Kant confirmed the head count. He quickly said, with each being worth 30 dinars, the sum would be 4,260 dinars. Kant's heart skipped a beat. He asked again, how much? It is 4,260 dinars. The leader lowered his head respectfully and added, if there were any other slave traders around, they may have offered more than I did. For that, I'm truly sorry, Lord Kant. Don't be. That's good enough. Kant gulped, struggling to keep his emotions in check. He had earned more than 4,000 dinars from selling 142 Jack Allen prisoners. This is explosively lucrative. Not only did the trade give Kant the funds needed for upgrading his forces, but he also gained enough to further develop his village by being able to build more buildings. It had also taken care of the weekly upkeep of his forces. All his problems were solved in one shot. Kant's eyes glimmered. He had suddenly discovered a good way of generating wealth. He licked his lips and looked at the leader. He asked, would you mind purchasing slaves for prolonged periods? I shall be here once every month. If you happen to have slaves to sell, I shall evaluate them. The leader nodded affirmatively and added, but, of course, I'd still prefer regular goods. If there were to be nothing else up for sale, then I shall purchase the slaves as well. Very well. Kant nodded with glittering eyes. Those Jack Allen slaves are all yours now. The leader excused himself and gestured to the people behind him. The 6 escorts and 12 mercenaries standing by immediately walked up to the Jack Allen prisoners with a vicious grin on the faces. They hoisted the prisoners up by the ropes, tying their hands, and headed for the grocery store. Those people had their own ways of making those Jack Allens obedient slaves. The 4,260 dinars were immediately added to Kant's account in his mind. The sum he had at the moment was 5,743 dinars. Time to get on with the upgrades. Given that he now had so much money, Kant had nothing to worry about. Chapter 44, Explosive Growth in Quality of Forces. With 5,743 dinars available, Kant had nothing to worry about. Even back in the game played in his past life, there was no doubt that such an amount of money was a huge sum. Kant immediately willed it and connected to the system. Open up the troop class page. A dialog box was seen on his retina. Kant's current forces were displayed. All of them had a plus sign behind the names of their respective troop classes. It meant that he only needed to pay the required amount of dinars to level them up and make them troop classes of higher level and greater combat capacity. I really am rich now. He only needed to reorganize his crippled forces standing guard all over the Oasis lookout. Upgradable troop class, Swadian Peasants X42. Spend 10 dinars each to upgrade to Swadian Recruit. Ding, you have surplus experience. Your forces can be upgraded consecutively. Upgradable troop class, Swadian Recruits X6. Spend 20 dinars each to upgrade to Swadian Militia. Ding, you have surplus experience. Your forces can be upgraded consecutively. Upgradable troop class, Swadian Militias X19. Spend 30 dinars each to upgrade to Swadian Footman / Swadian Skirmisher. Ding, you have surplus experience. Your forces can be upgraded consecutively. Upgradable troop class, Desert Bandits X17. Spend 25 dinars each to upgrade to Elite Desert Bandit. Ding, you have surplus experience. Your forces can be upgraded consecutively. All of them were troop classes available for upgrades to Kant. The upgrades required payment of 1,367 dinars. Upgrade them all. Kant nodded affirmatively and with style. At the moment, the 1,367 dinars was a small sum to him. It was money that needed to be spent anyway, so he did not hesitate. If his forces were formidable enough, it allowed him to gain as much money as he fancied. There was no shortage of Jack Allens in the Naran Desert. Troop class upgrading. The system was continuing to upgrade his troops. The 42 Swadian peasants instantly became 42 Swadian recruits. The 6 Swadian recruits became 6 Swadian militias. There was something different with the upgrade of the 19 Swadian militias. That was where routes for further upgrades split. Ding, optional upgrades are available for Swadian militias. Swadian Footman / Swadian Skirmisher. A dialog box was seen in the system. It was 2 entirely different routes from then on out. One specialized in melee combat while the other in ranged combat. Kant had long come to a decision about that. He made his choice without hesitation. Upgrade all of them to become Swadian footmen. Those troops were ideal for serving as the main infantry units on the battlefield. The bodies of the units became even stouter and stronger. Their equipment became something else altogether. They were no longer clad in leather-based armor from top to toe. That had been swapped for iron-based armor. It made them look like elite troops. They were armed with heavy spears, long swords, and thicker heater shields. They were clad in mail armors and standard infantry iron helmets. They wore thick leather boots covered in mail armor. It was a standard Swadian-styled armament. The Swadian footmen served as one of the main fighting forces on the battlefield. Further upgrades were divided into two different routes as well. Swadian man-at-arms / Swadian infantry. After getting past that stage, the king of land battles of the Kingdom of Swadia would become available. Be it infantry units for garrisoning or laying siege to cities or cavalry units excelling in fighting battles out in the open, the might of the strongest kingdom found on the continent of Caradia would have been known to all. However, it was not those troop classes from Swadia that saw the greatest change. There were still the 17 desert bandits. The bandits, who originated from the Saran Sultanate, acquired a huge amount of experience as well. All of them had been successfully upgraded. They became elite desert bandits. After the upgrade, the elite desert bandits were still armed with spears, but their close combat weapon became the heavy flanged mace. It was capable of causing greater blunt trauma damage and sported better armor penetration. Their hide-covered round shields, which were often seen in desert areas, remained unchanged. 2 additional javelins were added to the initial 4 they carried. All 6 had become heftier. Their initial leather armor was changed to scale armor, offering better defensive capacities. Those top-notch bandits of the Sarand Desert usually served as leaders or bosses of bandit gangs. Even the regular army of the Saran Sultanate was given quite a headache from those bandits, who proved even more ferocious than most. Combined with the desert bandits he would recruit from then on out, Kant would have formed his own elite cavalry force by then. Those elite forces were no match for the heavy cavalry units of the Kingdom of Swadia or even 4th-level cavalry units like the Sarandian horsemen, but those elite desert bandits were on par with mercenary riders available for recruiting in taverns. In some cases, the elite desert bandits were an even better choice. Prompts from the system did not end there. Ding surplus experience detected. Consecutive upgrades available. Would you like to proceed with further upgrades? It was an inquiry from the system. At that moment, there was no way Kant was about to object to making upgrades. As someone who had just gained riches, he nodded without hesitation and said, "Continue upgrading." Ding surplus experience from the system detected. Continue upgrading troop class. 42 Swadian recruits can all be upgraded. 6 Swadian militias can all be upgraded. However, the following dialog box from the system made Kant frown slightly. There were only 2 options for upgrades. It was the Swadian recruits or the Swadian militias. As for the Swadian footmen, who were all stronger units, they had no plus signs behind any of them. It was a key sign that was linked to their upgrades as heavy cavalry units. System, are those 2 the only ones available for upgrades? Kant frowned and asked the system in his mind, are the footmen not available for an upgrade? Unavailable. The system answered crisply as it had always been. The current amount of experience is only available for upgrading low-level troop classes. Please acquire more experience if you would like to upgrade mid-level troop classes. All right. Kant nodded exasperatingly. The system only told the truth. There was no point arguing with it. Upgrade cost, 540 dinars. Would you like to upgrade? Upgrade them to become Swadian footmen. Kant had chosen the route of melee combat for upgrades. He needed to get a sizable force of footmen ready. All 25 of his Swadian footmen were clad in mail armor and wore iron helmets. They were armed with heavy spears and heater shields, as well as wearing long swords at their waists. It made them look like the retainer knights he saw before. They had begun to look like elite troops. The 42 Swadian militia members appeared behind him. All of them were stout, well-armed, and wore a solemn expression. Swadian militia was a second-level troop class and a reliable main force among the low-level troop classes. It was especially so in the case of Kant's Swadian militias. Each one of them was armed with hunting crossbows. That meant Kant was able to put aside any considerations of upgrading his troops to become ranged combat units. He only needed to focus on melee combat units for the time being. After all, firing a round of bolts before charging with their spears made for a formidable assault. As for the Jack Allens, there was no way they were going to be able to withstand attacks from the Swadian militias, even if both sides were of equal numbers. It was even more so given that Kant had gained access to Swadian footmen. It made his forces even more formidable. Kant's dinar reserves dropped from 5,743 dinars to 3,836 dinars. He had spent nearly one-third of his dinar reserves with just those upgrades alone. The expenditure was worthwhile. It immediately enhanced the quality of Kant's forces. While he remained utterly incapable of fighting 2,000 Jack Allans, it hardly mattered since those Jack Allans would not have dared to show up anyway. It was no longer Kant who was living in fear. It was the Jack Allan tribe. It was worth noting that the massive force of 2,000 Jack Allans was utterly crushed altogether. Even the chieftain had died on the battlefield. With only scarred and terrified remnants remaining, there was no way they were going to come looking for trouble in the Oasis lookout. The Jack Allan tribe was probably setting up defenses, speculating in fear of just how many humans there were at the Oasis lookout. There was no way a Jack Allan force of more than 2,000 units would have been defeated by a small force. Their brains were incapable of figuring out that Kant, Sir Hobson, and Scholar Hank had managed to win despite being severely outnumbered. At the very least, the Jack Allans were terrified to their cores. Kant, on the other hand, was pleased with himself. The Jack Allans were now like treasure in his eyes. They were fine commodities to be traded for dinars. Best of all, it was a trade that required no capital. As long as Kant was able to amass a force sufficiently formidable, he had the ability to capture those beast-like humanoid races and sell them to the system's trade caravan for dinars. System, open up the mall for a prize draw. Kant connected to the system in his mind again with a grin on his face. He currently had 2 honors. Ding! System mall is open. 1 honor is required for every draw. A dialog box from the system was seen. There was a shut treasure chest on it. It symbolized the countless hidden treasures of the system. Chapter 45, A jungle that came with its own soil. Begin the draw. As he spoke, Kant's eyes shone with anticipation. A prize draw from the system provided far better rewards than those acquired from side quests. The treasure chest opened. Rainbow-colored lights were seen. Ding! You have acquired an item pack. You have opened the item pack and found Date Palm Jungle within. Acquired, Date Palm Jungle x 2 acres, matured trees. A card was seen on the system's dialog box. It was an image of a jungle as seen from above. It had lush trees growing in the sand. Dates were vaguely visible hanging on the branches, which were evidently ripe and ready to be harvested. Date palm trees. Kant was familiar with the tree. It was the most practical thing available in the desert. When he first arrived in the Naran desert, he had been given 20 date palm trees as a reward from a side quest. However, 20 trees were nothing compared to 2 whole acres worth of date palm trees. What kind of reward is this? Kant, who usually had a rational mind, found the reward to be somewhat ridiculous. While it seemed easy to plant 2 acres worth of date palm trees, there were only 7.5 acres of land for farming in the entire Oasis lookout. All of that land had been used for planting wheat. There was currently no space available for planting these date palm trees. At the moment, it was a totally useless reward. Ding! System prompt. All items acquired from prize draws will be completely materialized as seen in their card form. A dialog box reappeared on his retina. The system seemed to have detected Kant's unease about his prize. That line immediately made Kant frown. Completely materialized. Kant pondered on what those 2 words meant. He knew that any prompts given by the system always meant something. He willed and summoned the card he had just acquired on his retina. There was no way the 2 acres worth of date palm trees could have been fully illustrated on that small card. Instead, it was just a small part of the jungle as seen from above being illustrated. It included the sand where the trees were planted. When he saw that, Kant's heart raced. He cross-referenced his thoughts with the hint given by the system. He quickly realized what the system meant. Oh, don't tell me. He headed straight for the northern end of the Oasis lookout. That was where the agricultural area of Trondheim was located and the 20 date palm trees were planted. The items acquired completely materialized as was seen in their card form. If what those words meant was exactly what he speculated them to be, he was about to gain himself a tremendous windfall. It was a windfall comparable to how he had gained a new council hall when he first came to the Oasis lookout. That needed building symbolized the beginning of the establishment of Trondheim. This is it. Kant swiftly headed to the northern end of Oasis lookout. The crude network of irrigation channels had been completed. Fresh spring water flowed in them, rendering the farm, which consisted mostly of sand, wet. The precious fresh water supply spread throughout the originally barren land. Using the irrigation channels allowed for the 14 plots to be divided from the 7.5 acres. It was still a desert. Even soil found in an oasis consisted mostly of sand. The irrigation channels had been specifically dug to ensure ample irrigation. The sprouting of the seedlings meant that the channels, planned and dug by Kant and the peasants, worked as they were supposed to. At the moment, however, Kant set his sights on the 2 rows of date palm trees. The 20 date palm trees were planted neatly at the border where the oasis and desert beyond met. They were lush. They looked very green and pretty. They added color to the otherwise barren, boring yellowish tone of the place. Kant suddenly hesitated. He gulped and took a deep breath before asking, "System, can I plant the date palm jungle here?" "You could," the system answered. A glimmer was seen in Kant's eyes as he willed the card in his mind into existence. A mystical aura instantly emerged. Data streams of staggering numbers were seen deep in Kant's eyes. They shot out like a hurricane at the desert before him, systematically enveloping only the 2 acres of land. The process only took seconds. The data streams began to recede. Right before Kant's eyes, a jungle filled with tall, sprightly trees was now seen. A date palm jungle had emerged. "I knew it." Kant gulped. His hands were clenched in excitement. His gaze moved to the base of the stout trunks. Instead of finding yellowish, soft sand beneath, he saw brownish, solidified sandy soil. The place had literally been terraformed. It was the only term appearing in Kant's mind that he felt was adequate to describe his shock of the scene. Kant finally realized just how powerful the system was at that very moment. It was capable of entirely changing a landscape. The system had just transformed the seeming useless sand into a sandy soil capable of being used for farming. That power surpassed the understanding of common folks. It made it seem like a divine miracle of sorts. In fact, it had been nothing short of a miracle, since it was a sandy soil that could have only been created through the great powers wielded by gods. "This is my cheat." Kant quelled his excitement. He worked hard to calm himself down. The system of the game was available only to him. He alone wielded such mystical powers. There was no reason for him to get excessively excited about things. Once he managed to calm himself down, everything would return to feeling normal. He eyed the densely packed date palm trees and sighed. "This is just magnificent." Lush date palm trees were planted in neat rows. The way they were planted seemed to have been planned since the trees had been saplings, which was why they currently looked very neat. Full, ripe purplish-red dates were situated in clusters beneath the signature long, slender leaves of the stout, tall palm trees. That meant the dates were definitely ready for harvest. All of the date palm trees were now bearing viable fruit. The date palm trees, which were all over 22 feet tall, seemed to have shrouded the northern side of the desert from sight. Kant had no idea just how many of those trees could be planted on 2 acres worth of land. Ding system prompt. 50 date palm trees can be planted on 1 acre of land. The current total of 2 acres of land has 100 date palm trees. The subsequent dialog box from the system gave the answer that Kant sought. "Nice, very nice indeed." Kant grinned at the thoughtful system. His face was adorned with a beaming smile. With so many date palm trees now available, his current problem with food was completely solved. Even if his forces were to eat only dates and drink only spring water from the oasis, it was enough to last them at least half a year. If the trees were meticulously taken care of, another batch of dates would be ready for harvest in another 6 months. He finally realized why people native to the Middle Eastern deserts of Earth planted so few crops of other kinds yet had such an abundance of date palm trees. The dates, which were known to be desert bread in the minds of the desert people, were comparable to staple foods like wheat, rice, and others. He instantly made a decision. Kant speculated that if he called upon all of his people to pluck the dates, the harvest would probably be enough to fill the entire storage room. The amount of harvested from 100 date palm trees was equal to the total amount of crops planted by a village. They provided ample food for at least 300 people over the course of months. It was more than enough to last until the next harvest. The harvest was thought to have been able to last for half a year. If the ripe dates were harvested in time, the trees would likely bear fruit even sooner. 6 months was only an estimate of the time required for the dates to become ripe and ready to be eaten. The trees, which grew in a desert climate, were free from the interference of seasons. They were able to bear fruit at any time of the year. Therefore, his people had the opportunity to secure a steady supply all year long. It was a huge advantage over fruit trees planted on flatlands and mountains yet were affected by weather conditions. That was why date palm trees were considered something else altogether. Then again, the trees could absolutely do more than just provide food. Kant licked his lips. Kant, who hailed from Earth in his past life, knew without a doubt that if there were a huge number of trees found in an oasis, the oasis would have been considered a mature oasis capable of forming a self-sustaining ecosystem. Photosynthesis of the trees and evaporation of water enabled effective temperature regulation throughout the oasis. Days could potentially become less hot, and nights could potentially become less cold. If they worked on the land between the trees further, it enabled the planting of more drought-resistant crops. As long as irrigation and fertilization were sustained, one had the potential to plant vegetables and fruit trees. Such was the way of farming invented by desert people. Eventually, it would have been possible to keep small animals, such as breeds of chicken and goats capable of surviving in a desert or desert horses, around. The emergence of the jungle really has brought the development of the village back on track again. Kant felt overwhelmed and excited. Products provided by the system were nothing short of the best. There was no way defective products were found among them. Kant's eyes glistened at the thought that he still had one honor left. It meant that he could continue drawing yet another prize. He was getting anxious. System, begin the draw again. Chapter 46, Firentis the Wandering Knight. The treasure chest shown on his retina reopened. As he confirmed his choice, the last honor Kant had disappeared. A faint rainbow glimmer was seen as the treasure chest slowly opened. Ding, you have acquired a hero pack. You have opened the hero pack and found Firentis, the Wandering Knight from Swadia. Acquired, Firentis the Wandering Knight, the only hero. A card appeared on his retina. It was not a building or an item illustrated on the card. It was the image of a young knight. He was looking ahead, seemingly gazing at something. However, the knight's eyes were filled with sorrow. He looked as though he was perhaps hesitant or anticipating something. Kant was slightly jolted. However, he quickly grinned. He was quite familiar with the wandering knight known as Firentis. Materialize. His will connected to the system. The card in his mind disappeared into golden specks of light. On a nearby dune, a rider clad in mail armor and a linen robe riding a chestnut-colored warhorse had become visible. The rider seemed to have just appeared there by chance. The rider halted his horse at the top of the dune, seemingly watching the oasis lookout. He had the appearance of a traveler who had been on a long journey and just discovered a village. The rider slowly rode down the dune. Firentis, a noble of Swadia. Kant wore a wide grin as he watched the rider heading toward him. Kant was impressed with Firentis, the man who called himself a wandering knight. He thought, this is one righteous guy who managed to hold on to his beliefs in this messed up world. He is a true knight. Kant knew that man quite well. Firentis was a decent character back in the game. He was a hero who stood fast to the principles of knighthood. The knight was kind-hearted and compassionate to the weak. Firentis was someone who hailed from a militaristic noble clan in Swadia. He was proficient at combat and leading forces into combat. Furthermore, he held fast to the code of knights and was eager to lay the hammer down on crime and evil. He never robbed commoners or attacked villages with force. After defending villagers from invading bandits, he had even refused gifts from them. If a player committed any of the above acts, Firentis would have immediately left the party. Those actions violated the principles he held so steadfastly in this messed up place of a world. While he seemed insignificant, he was still shining like a star. Furthermore, personal problems never caused him to leave a party. Firentis had not cared about realistic problems, such as pay being delayed or a food shortage. He always remained waiting for orders from the party despite any problems. That was why Kant liked the knight very much. Firentis was a true knight who never resorted to cunning tricks or sheepishly fled from the battlefield. He also had a great sense of responsibility. A party that was in the early stages of establishment could not have asked for a better member. Greetings, Lord Kant. Firentis came before Kant, deftly halting and getting off his horse. He looked at Kant quietly after briskly getting off his horse. His eyes glittered for a bit before he half-kneeled before Kant and said, although I have never met you, your kind actions of taking in the refugees have impressed me. Welcome aboard, Firentis. Kant was slightly stunned, but he quickly came to his senses. Kant's intention of taking the refugees in was only to add to the population of his village. In the eyes of Firentis, it was an act of mercy for the weak that deserved praise. Firentis lowered his head and replied, it would be my honor to serve you. Kant helped him up. Firentis was his first hero general and one of the best combatants available in the game. Kant was overjoyed to have Firentis join in his forces. Firentis was a noble as well as a knight with formidable combat prowess. He was capable of leading troops into battle, as well as fighting on his own. Firentis' arrival alleviated Kant's pressure in commanding Trondheim's current growing fighting force. The knight was able to make his forces fight more efficient. After chatting with Firentis for a bit, Kant was even more pleased. Kant was of noble birth in that world as well, yet he relied mostly on self-study when it came to affairs of war. Firentis had provided him with a systematic elaboration on how to make use of the fighting forces of the Kingdom of Swadia. Besides, he was a true Swadian and a knight from a militaristic clan. He was proficient in matters like leading Swadian fighting forces into battle and using strategies and tactics. From what Kant knew, Firentis the Wandering Knight was a person who walked the talk. My stress is considerably lessened with a general leading the forces. Kant sighed, but he looked happy and contented. He had been the one leading the battles with the Jack Allens. While he had managed to win every single one of those battles, those victories made Kant realize that it was crucial to bring superior troop classes to bear down on any enemies. When it came to details with strategies and tactics, he had nothing truly out of the ordinary to offer. To put it precisely, he knew next to nothing about strategies and tactics. All that he learned about war from games, movies, television series, and novels could not be counted as experience on the real battlefield. At the very least, Kant knew that he was the one who was talking about things he knew little about. There was a lot he could learn from Firentis. Oh, right, Lord Kant. Firentis interrupted his thoughts. His rather hesitant tone piqued Kant's curiosity. What is it, Firentis? Well, Lord Kant, I'd like to first apologize for my rudeness. Firentis lowered his head and sighed, saying, I saw a group of homeless vagrants on my way here, and I told them that there is a merciful Lord, as well as hope for a better life, to be found here. A prompt from the system was heard when Firentis was done speaking. Ding, side quest assigned. Side quest, Firentis refugees. Reward, Swadian Militias X-28. Introduction. Firentis led a group of refugees, who had nowhere to go, to the Oasis. He is hoping that a merciful lord such as yourself will take them in. The dialogue box was seen clearly on his retina. Kant's eyes glimmered. The grin on his face turned into boisterous laughter. Sure. Is there a reason why I wouldn't take them in? As he turned to look at Firentis, Kant was in a considerably better mood. He said, I would always welcome refugees into my village. I would bring them new hope, should they choose to believe in me. Your compassion is impressive. Firentis lowered his head with the utmost respect from the bottom of his heart. Ding, you have chosen to mercifully take in the refugees. Side quest, Firentis refugees completed. Reward acquired, Swadian Militias X-28. Introduction. It is a wise choice to absorb refugees to boost the population. However, it is worth noting that too many refugees will strain the village, affecting the mood of the peasants. A dialogue box from the system quickly appeared. The assignment and completion of the side quest took less than 2 minutes. The reward seemed to have been something like a free lunch. Kant was pleased with the turn of events. Be it the incoming refugees or the new 28 Swadian militias added to his forces, all of them were vital human resources to the current Oasis lookout. At the very least, Kant had yet to encounter the overpopulation mentioned by the system's introduction. Fighting wars was the best way to keep populations in check. At the very moment, Trondheim had a lack of peasants, troops, defensive measures, and civilian buildings. The place had a shortage of everything. The arrival of more refugees was a boon to him. It was worth noting that the 100 date palm trees spread over the 2 acres of land had the potential to produce more than 4,400 pounds of dates. Kant had been racking his brains on how to divide his forces to pluck the dates. At that moment, a huge labor force was sent his way. Soldiers, who knew mostly how to hack and slash, were more suited for combat. Farm work and menial labor were best left to the peasants. They are here. Firentis looked up at the dune from which he had come. A huge group of refugees in ragged clothing was helping each other up as they moved. The 28 Swadian militia members were surrounding and protecting the refugees. They all looked exhausted, but they all cheered in excitement when they saw Trondheim appear before their eyes. Their steps immediately quickened. All of those people had been Kant's side quest and reward from the side quest. He had gained 200 Swadian peasants and 28 Swadian militia members. Get them food and water. Kant nodded and ordered several recruits not far away, make sure they have enough to eat and drink. Yes, my lord. The recruits immediately nodded and headed toward the spring water pond to the south. Smoke immediately billowed from the council hall's kitchen. The fragrance of cooking food gradually spread throughout the place. The refugees, who had all been on an arduous journey, needed a good rest. Kant would have never taken them to be numb, unfeeling NPCs. They were all people of flesh and blood. At the least, he had to ensure that those people had their stomachs filled. Chapter 47, Current Data. Several days passed. As dawn approached, a new week began. The first piece of news that the system delivered was regarding his force's salaries. In an instant, 1,384 dinars disappeared. Kant now only had 2,452 dinars left in his account. He recalled having a staggering sum of nearly 6,000 dinars just a few days ago. Now, more than half of that sum was already gone. He immediately felt exasperated at just how costly it was to maintain a fighting force. The Oasis lookout currently had only 300 troops to feed, yet about 1,500 dinars had to be spent every week just to keep all of them fed. His main expenditure was undoubtedly the upkeep of his soldiers. The amount of food consumed every week required more than 100 dinars. He was in the council hall. Kant was quite troubled by all the petty matters he had to take care of. The dialogue box on his retina was put away. He unconsciously rubbed his eyebrow. For now, the threat of the Jack Allens was gone. Without enemies to fight, he needed to put the development of the Oasis lookout back at the top of his priority list. Trondheim was still at the earliest stage of its development. Many of the buildings available had yet been built. Most of his peasants and troops were still sleeping in crude tents and sandpits at night. Open the datasheet. Kant willed and connected with the system in his mind. The system instantly appeared on his retina. It brought up the latest datasheet. Trondheim. Lord, Kent. Balance, 2,452 dinars. General, Firentis. Type, Swadian village. Current population, 200. Buildings, Council Hall, House, 5, Watchtower, Desert Bandit Lair, Grocery Store. Available for construction, House, Wall, Mill, Well. Resources, Date Palm Jungle, 2 acres, Wheatfield, 7.5 acres. Fighting Force Summary, Infantry, 95, Cavalry, 17. Current Forces, Swadian Militias, 70, Swadian Footmen, 25, Desert Bandit Elites, 17. Recruitable, Swadian Recruits, Council Hall, Desert Bandits, Desert Bandit Lair. Comment, Trondheim looks to be in good shape. Cool, refreshing spring water flows in the rugged irrigation channels, nourishing the barren, dry land. High-spirited peasants work in the jungle and fields, looking very lively. The village still seems crude due to a shortage of buildings. It is worth noting that there are no women in the village. That summed up the data regarding the current state of Trondheim. Kant felt rather heavy. His village looked rather dilapidated. The place was really just too crude. Due to the threat from the Jack Allans over a week ago, Kant had been putting all of his efforts into building his fighting force. It could have been said that he had completely neglected to develop his fief altogether, which in turn caused the delayed development of Trondheim. However, there was nothing he had been able to do about it. The threat from the Jack Allans had been too great to be ignored. If it had not been for Sir Hobson and Scholar Hank from the Dukedom of Leo offering their assistance, Kant probably would not have been able to defend his fief. There was no way he could have defended his place against a threat posed by 2,000 strong Jack Allans. It's a good thing that everything turned out fine. Kant sighed in exasperation and began putting his thoughts into developing his fief. The evaluation of Trondheim by the system was correct. There was a severe shortage of buildings. At the very least, he needed to ensure that everyone was able to stay in houses instead of tents and sandpits. He made his decision and connected to the system. Construct houses. Ding system prompt. The construction of houses requires 100 dinars and 7 days to complete. Would you like to construct? A dialog box from the system appeared, asking the usual questions regarding construction. Construct. Kant made his choice without hesitation. The crisp clanging sound of metal coins was heard as he confirmed his choice. It sounded rather pleasant. However, 100 dinars immediately disappeared from his account. That was the price paid for constructing the houses. 100 dinars spent. House, under construction. Completion, 7 days. The system's dialog box refreshed as he finished making his choice. A team of builders, which consisted of 10 workhorses and 5 carriages, was seen on a dune not far away. More than 30 stout builders followed along the side of the convoy, helping to move the carriages in the soft sand. Since the carriages were filled with wooden and stone materials, it was easy to tell that the team was transporting materials needed for construction. A fat guy was in the lead. While the man looked simple and honest, the unmistakable cunningness of a merchant was seen in his eyes. Before long, they arrived at the Oasis lookout. The 10 Swadian militia members holding heavy spears diligently inspected their cargo. The builders seemed to have been used to all of that. After all, rules were aplenty in the fiefs of nobles. Foreman, Lord Kant wishes to speak with you in the council hall. A Swadian footman quickly approached the caravan and glanced at the team of builders. He set his gaze on the foreman and said in a crass manner, come with me. Sure, sure. The foreman did not look offended. He followed the solider with a flattering grin on his face. Surviving in the messed up continent of Caradia and being able to earn great profits required sacrifices. For instance, dignity and face were often overlooked as those were deemed near worthless in most cases. The foreman quickly went into the council hall. He was rather familiar with the place. Kant was sitting in the council hall, reading the parchment in his hand. There was a packed list written on the parchment. It listed everything the Revatanian trade caravan had in its possession. He was thinking of making some last-minute purchases before the trade caravan left. Good morning, revered Lord Kant. The foreman bowed respectfully. He sounded rather pleased as he said, "Your humble servant hereby greets you." "Oh, it's you again." Kant put down the parchment on his hand and nodded to the foreman. However, he still picked on the errors in the sentence blurted by the foreman, correcting the man in a plain tone. "Take note. I'm just your employer, and you're not a servant of mine. In my mind, you are of far greater nobility than King Harlaus." The foreman did not seem to care about what was said and took his buttering effort up a notch. "You are the light of dawn in all of Caradia." Hee hee. Kant chuckled. Kant never paid any heed to such obvious, typical bootlicking words. Furthermore, Kant knew that the foreman was rather sly. While the man was no doubt able to finish his job in a timely manner, he was the type who would steal pieces of bread for supper during mealtimes, even if he were to be unable to finish them. The foreman was no doubt a very tight-fisted hoarder of sorts. Kant went on to warn the foreman in a rather stern expression, "Be just as serious with the construction of the houses. Please rest assured. I and my team of builders live on our reputation." The foreman hung his head, seemingly aware that he had been overdoing his bootlicking act. Kant nodded, feeling satisfied with the foreman's attitude. Kant traded a few words with the foreman, telling the foreman just how keen he was about the progress and workmanship of the buildings, before waving to dismiss him. It was crucial to develop his fief, so the foreman needed to know his priorities. Besides, Kant still had other matters to look into. He turned around and glanced at the Swadian footman standing guard behind the door. He said, "Get me the leader of the trade caravan." "Understood." The Swadian footman nodded and walked out of the council hall. The foreman arrived shortly after. "What do you need of me, Lord Kant?" His attitude remained respectful. "Right." Kant took out the parchment and pointed to the list of supplies on it. "I'm thinking of buying all of these before you leave." The Revatanian trade caravan was only staying there for 7 days. This was the day they planned to leave. They had packed everything, which included more than 100 Jack Allen prisoners with their hands tied behind their backs. They had been starved until they were able to barely stand. They looked miserable as they were tied behind the carriages. 2 cans of oil and 10 sets of tools. The leader took a look at the marked goods and muttered as he repeated the list, 5 rolls of linen cloth. "Any problems with that?" Kant asked. That was the goods he was thinking of purchasing. They were needed for further development of his place. Kant, however, felt exasperated with the prices. The prices of items were steep all over the continent of Caradia, which was about 30% higher than that found back on Earth. Considering that those were things only provided to him by the system, Kant had no choice but to bear with it. Besides, benefits would eventually come from the price he had to pay. As long as he grew strong and formidable enough, he could easily use the Jack Allens to pay his bills. Slave trade was indeed tempting. Chapter 48, A New Main Quest. "No problem, Lord Kant." The leader put down the parchment. He hesitantly said, "Oil, tools, and linen cloth. We have all of that in the caravan, but I'm afraid the price would be rather steep." "How much would they cost?" Kant asked in a rather nonchalant tone. 2 cans of oil is 1,000 dinars. The 10 sets of tools are 2,000 dinars, and the 5 rolls of linen cloth cost 1,000 dinars. The leader completed the calculations and looked at Kant. Continuing in the same hesitant tone, he said, "It would cost 4,000 dinars, but I could give you a discount. You would only need to pay 3,800 dinars for all of these goods." 3,800 dinars. Kant rubbed his chin, thinking about how steep that price was. However, he smiled and asked, "In that case, would it be possible for me to barter using the dates?" "Of course, that would be no problem." The leader of the trade caravan was slightly startled. After doing the calculations, he nodded and said, "However, we would only take high-grade dates like those from before. We would only want 76 baskets. One date palm tree produced 2 baskets of dates." Kant currently had 120 date palm trees in his fief, which meant that 240 baskets of dates could have been produced. If each basket was worth 50 dinars each, the total amount of dates would have been worth 12,000 dinars. That was why Kant was confident enough to buy that many things in one go. If the Rivadanian trade caravan had ample dinars to spare, Kant would have even immediately asked for cash. It was a pity that the trade caravan only had 3,000 dinars to spare. As such, he had no choice but to resort to barter. "Well, 76 baskets of dates will be no problem at all." Kant smiled as he nodded, agreeing to it right away. The 200 peasants had been busy the past 2 days harvesting all of the dates hanging from the 100 date palm trees. The 200 baskets of dates were dried under the sun on linen cloths, turning the fresh dates into dried dates. There was no way they could have finished eating them all. It was of the utmost importance to barter what they had in abundance for the items they lacked most in the Oasis lookout. The trade was sealed. The supplies Kant had asked for were carted off of the carriages. The 76 baskets of dried dates were stacked next to the door of the grocery store. The amount was so staggering that they almost clogged the street. The baskets of dates were soon carted off to the carriages by the mercenaries, who were currently doubling as coolies. One basket of dates after another was put onto the carriages. 3 carriages were filled with the 76 baskets of dates. This was something would have never been possible outside of the system. When he saw how the way things were packed on the carriages hardly changed, Kant had thoughts running through his head. The system definitely had some sort of space folding techniques. In reality, the 76 baskets of dates should have filled at least 5 carriages. "Farewell." The leader of the trade caravan remained respectful as he talked to Kant before leaving. "Thank you, Lord Kant, for your generous hospitality throughout the week. If things go well, we will meet again next month. I shall bring you more of what you would need by then. See you next month." Kant nodded. Both parties bade each other farewell. The Rivadanian trade caravan embarked on its journey. The 3 carriages slowly moved toward the dunes. The members of the trade caravan remained the same. It included 1 leader, 6 escorts, and 12 sentries. They climbed over the dune and quickly disappeared like a mirage. They were returning to the continent of Karadia through the system's mystical powers, heading straight for Rivadan, a city of Viegir. Kant was naturally used to it by now. It was how the system had always worked. "All of you, come here." Kant turned around and called the 10 Swadian militia members to his side. He pointed at the supplies on the street and ordered, "Put all of those back into the storage room of the council hall. Be careful not to break anything fragile." "Understood." The 10 Swadian militia members nodded. They efficiently worked together to move the supplies left behind by the trade caravan. The fragile items Kant had mentioned was the oil. Those 2 cans of oil were luxury items worth 500 dinars each. The oil was made of high-grade animal fat. Not only was the oil edible, but it was also used for maintaining weapons and making flames. Since the oil was considered tactical supplies, commoners were not allowed to consume it. Oil was something that every lord needed a supply of in their storehouses. Kant had many uses for the oil. "Since my father still hasn't completely cast me away, I might as well try getting in touch with the dukedom of Leo." He frowned slightly, making his calculations. While the main part of his plan to strengthen his grip on the Naran Desert and secretly develop the place, it was impossible to just stay in the barren desert and sever the connection with the dukedom. At the very least, there was the salt mine he planned to take in the future. He needed a way to sell the salt produced. The only route he had within his grasp was the dukedom of Leo. Furthermore, in the process of making white salt, charcoal played a crucial role, both as fuel and a filter. Wood was only found in the Sinway range, which separated the dukedom from the desert. Kant had no way of securing such supplies elsewhere. The tools he had bought were actually 10 high-grade wood-cutting axes made of iron. Kant had his own plans for those axes. He planned on sending Swadian peasants to a secluded spot in the range. They would build a logging camp there. By then, he hoped to have the elite desert bandits collect the crude raw salts at the alkali soil. While the cost for sending 2 different teams to 2 different locations was quite high, if the operations proved sustainable and the finest of white salt was produced, the trade sealed with the dukedom basically created a beneficial cycle. The returns had the potential to be unimaginably high. Gallop, gallop, gallop. The rushed galloping noises of horses were heard. Kant looked up at the northeastern dune. More than a dozen riders were seen approaching. Kant's expression remained unchanged. It was not the enemy. Those were the 17 elite desert bandits led by Firentis, who were returning after making their patrols. The patrols were made 3 times a day, once in the morning, once in the afternoon, and once at night. While the Oasis lookout had a watchtower, the view was still somewhat limited. As such, he had the light cavalry units ride out and scout the deeper parts of the desert to see if there had been any unusual footprints found in the sand. They were to deal with any anomalies as soon as possible. Halt! Firentis led the cavalry units back and slowed his horse down. He saw Kant inspecting the place at one end of the street. He immediately got off his horse and respectfully bowed before saying, "Good morning, Lord Kant." "Good morning, Firentis." Kant nodded and took a glance at the 17 stout elite desert bandits and asked, "Did you find anything out of the ordinary?" "Nothing at all. Everything is safe." Firentis grinned and added in a relieved tone, "That is the best." "Of course." Kant nodded at the same time. They were at the developmental stage of things. If the Jack Allans continued to harass them, it would have caused Kant quite a headache. As the victor of the previous battle, Kant still had the initiative for the time being. Time was one of the spoils of victory. If Kant sped up Trondheim's development within a short time, becoming strong enough to resist that Jack Allan tribe, everything was bound to take a turn for the better. Kant wholeheartedly believed that. He knew he would have the final victory. "Besides, I still have 3 volleys of arrows left unused." Kant exhaled and felt more confident than usual. 3 volleys of arrows from 500 Viegir marksmen were no joke. They had the ability to create a rain of arrows that enveloped quite a large area. They were the strongest archers available. The arrows they used were also the best barreled arrows. If such a rain of arrows fell onto the Jack Allans, which wore no armor and held no shields, it would have resulted in huge losses on their side. If Kant put all 3 volleys to good use, the effects would have been comparable to that from a charge of 50 highly skilled retainer knights. Firentis. Kant felt rather anxious at that thought. "Please speak, Lord Kant," Firentis immediately replied. Kant, however, stayed silent for several seconds. He looked at Firentis and asked, "In your opinion, what are the odds of us winning if we were to take on the Jack Allan tribe with the number of troops we have at the moment?" Firentis was quite surprised by the question. It was obvious that he had no ideas to offer regarding those wild, unrealistic thoughts Kant had. To put it precisely, Firentis had a good grasp of the size of Kant's current forces. There were less than 100 dedicated combatants. Even with the peasants added as auxiliary troops, they only had a force consisting of nearly 300 units. It was utterly ridiculous to think that such a force was able to attack a large tribe that had more than 2,000 Jack Allans in it. However, a system prompt suddenly appeared on Kant's retina. Ding! Main quest assigned. Main quest, the first powerful enemy. Quest reward, 10,000 dinars, 1,000 reputation, 10 honor. Introduction, the first powerful enemy encountered in one's life will forever remain unforgettable. The enemy symbolizes power and invincibility, just like how giants left a lasting impression in one's heart when one was young. It is but the first obstacle one faces in life. While the impression is a lasting one, it actually symbolizes the fear before one becomes powerful. Chapter 49, Firentis Strategy. Ding! Main quest assigned. Main quest, the first powerful enemy. Quest reward, 10,000 dinars, 1,000 reputation, 10 honor. Introduction, the first powerful enemy encountered in one's life will remain unforgettable. The enemy symbolizes power and invincibility, just like how giants leave a lasting impression in one's heart when one is young. It is but the first obstacle one faces in life. While the impression is a lasting one, it actually symbolizes fear before becoming powerful. The dialog box from the system was clear and unmistakable. Kant's pupils slightly contracted as he scanned the contents in the dialog box. He felt rather stunned by it all. He forcefully regained his calm as a bitter smile appeared on his face. It seems like I've gotten myself cornered. He had only made a simple inquiry to Firentis. He had asked if they had the ability to get rid of the Jack Allen tribe. He knew the chance of doing so was slim. He had asked the question on a whim. He never expected the system to issue a quest right after he asked the question. It was impossible to not become restless about it. He knew that despite the Jack Allen tribe having lost more than 800 Jack Allens after suffering a defeat when they last fought, the tribe still had the decisive edge in terms of numbers. Kant's mere 300-strong force was not able to compare even closely. Worse still, 200 out of the 300 were peasants. They were a zero-level troop class, which was the lowest of all troop classes. This is really frustrating. Kant let out a long sigh. He felt totally overwhelmed. Kant steadied his emotions as he looked at Firentis. He asked, if we were to have 500 Viager marksmen on our side, what do you think our chances of winning are? He was referring to the 3 volleys of arrows. That would be no problem then. Firentis was slightly stunned but immediately added, of course, Lord Kant, if we had 500 Viager marksmen on our side, running over those brutal Jack Allens would be a piece of cake. Firentis, who was of Sunno nobility, had no doubt known regarding the capabilities of Viager marksmen. The kingdoms of Swadia and Viager were not on good terms. In truth, both kingdoms had fought several large-scale battles over the ownership of the northern icy plains. If it had not been for the kingdom of Rodok's betrayal, the Nords invading from the sea, and harassment at the plains from the Kyrgyz Khanate, Swadia and Viager would have likely continued fighting to this day. Viager marksmen are capable of continuously raining arrows throughout the battlefield. Firentis' expression grew serious as he said, coupled with our infantry forces, we could definitely crush that Jack Allen tribe with a frontal assault. Kant nodded. He still looked rather awkward. Firentis had misunderstood what he meant. He paused for a bit and said, those marksmen are capable of only firing 3 volleys. What Kant said made Firentis frown. 3 volleys? That's all. Indeed. Kant nodded in exasperation. The Viager marksman was a 5th-level troop class in the original system of the game. They were a top-level troop class. Not even the kingdom of Viager in the game had been able to amass a staggering number of 500 top-notch marksmen without using cheats. If they were available in massive formations, exceptionally formidable archers of that sort were a force to be reckoned with on the battlefield. If a rain of arrows were unleashed from 500 Viager marksmen in an orderly formation, infantry forces without shields and armor would instantly know what nightmare in a battlefield was truly like. As a player, Kant knew just how fearsome those archers were. However, that was where the problem lied. Regardless of the 500 Viager marksmen or not, he did not have even one Nord archer, which was widely considered as the trashiest of ranged combatants, in his forces. He only had 70 Swadian militia members standing in as ranged combatants, armed with their hunting crossbows. In truth, the power of hunting crossbows was hardly considered lethal to creatures with life force as strong as that of the Jack-Allans. Lord Kent, if we were to launch a front assault then, we would absolutely stand no chance. Firentis frowned hard. In a severe tone, he said, we need to rely on effective strategies that are capable of dealing a crushing blow to their morale so those primitive beasts fall into chaos. That will make them lose all courage to fight. Please continue, Kent said. If both men were to be compared regarding fighting strategies, although he knew a thing or two about them, his knowledge paled in comparison to that of Firentis. Firentis was not known as the Wandering Knight for no reason. He had been wandering the continent of Caradia for many years on a journey of penance. At the same time, it allowed him to amass ample fighting experience. Lord Kent, I thank you for your humbleness. Firentis sensed how much Kent appreciated having him around. He bowed slightly and said, it works similar to the battle you told me about. It was the one in which you defeated an invasion from 2,000 Jack-Allans by working with 50 retainer knights who were all heavy cavalry units. That was due to having allies, Kent replied. If it had not been for Sir Hobson and Sculler, Kent would have probably ended up dead in that brutal battle. As such, that battle left a lasting impression on him. Allies, hey? Firentis lowered his head and looked on with a puzzled expression, before saying, perhaps. Do you feel it to be otherwise, Firentis? Kent frowned. Firentis solemnly continued, clarifying Kent's doubt, Lord Kent, your father exiled you to the barren desert. There was no way he could have sent help to rescue you after doing so. From my perspective, your father was probably only trying to retrieve your dead body. Despite being a kind-hearted person, Firentis had wandered the continent of Caradia long enough to deeply understand the darker side of things with people. Furthermore, Firentis was of noble birth himself. That was why he turned against his own younger brother for a seductress and eventually ended up accidentally killing his brother. That led him to choose to leave his family behind, exiling himself to the continent of Caradia to go on a journey to polish his spirit as a knight and seek penance while doing so. It might actually be so. Kent did not confirm nor deny Firentis' judgment in the matter. He looked up slightly at the winding dunes and said, at the very least, Sir Hobson and Master Hank, along with the 50 retainer knights, helped me repel the Jack-Allans. Right. Firentis remained silent. He had a rather complicated expression as if he knew what Kent said was true. Kent let out a long sigh. They were able to tell that the Jack-Allans were entirely capable of breaking through to the Oasis lookout and killing every single one of us, yet they chose to risk their lives and help me. He paused before saying in a serious tone, maybe they did not want to see me dead after all. He smiled nonchalantly and did not continue discussing the matter. If Kent had a strong castle and powerful forces at his disposal, he might have been able to easily crush the Jack-Allans without help from anyone else. It was a world where might made right. Well, would we still stand a chance of taking down that Jack-Allan tribe? Kent steered the conversation back to the topic. He looked at Firentis and said, would 3 volleys of arrows from 500 Viegir marksmen be enough to cause massive casualties to the Jack-Allan forces and trigger mass panic? It's entirely capable of doing so. Firentis pondered for a bit and nodded affirmatively. There's no doubt about that. Tell me your plan, Kent said. Firentis gathered his words and replied, Lord Kent, I remember that you said when you took over the Oasis lookout, you did so using terrain advantage and the sun. That caused that small Jack-Allan tribe to be caught off guard and get crushed outright, right? That was how it was done. I only had 20 allied knights to serve as shock troops, as well as 30 low-level troops at my disposal. As he spoke, Kent felt rather pleased with himself. The strategy was well employed back then because he used terrain and the sun to his advantage. It had enabled them to eventually kill all of the Jack-Allans squatting at the Oasis lookout and win the battle. Firentis, who was a veteran in the battlefield, felt rather impressed with it and said, "That would be what I intend to do." "Hold on." Kant's grin, which stemmed from self-praise, was somewhat rescinded. Looking at Firentis' serious expression, Kant immediately voiced his doubts as he frowned, "But things are different this time. There are just too many of the Jack Allens around." "Yes, they are many." Firentis nodded, but his eyes brightened as he said, "But all of them are useless." Kant frowned hard, waiting for Firentis to continue. Without hesitation, Firentis said, "Those Jack Allens are all scattered forces from that defeat. While the weeks since then allowed them to ease the fear and panic from that defeat, if they were to be crushed yet again, they would totally lose the ability to get themselves organized." "So, are you saying?" Kant paused for a moment before asking, "Are they now like a burned child dreading the fire?" He adapted the term using the native language of the place, but the expression was still similar. Firentis nodded and affirmatively said, "Indeed. That is what our strategy would be based on." Chapter 50, Preparing for a Great Battle. "That is too risky." Kant mulled over the proposal. He did not want to adopt that strategy. As the supreme commander of his forces in the operation, Kant needed to make responsible decisions. It was not about being responsible for the Oasis lookout, Trondheim, or even the Swadians occupying the place. He had to be responsible for himself. If he lost that battle, it would cost him everything he had. That was what caused him the greatest anxiety and hesitation. People died in wars, but there was a certain number of casualties that were deemed tolerable. If the resulting casualties exceeded what Kant deemed acceptable, he might as well have lost the battle even if he actually won. He was not going to let something like that happen. As such, he slowly opened his mouth and asked, "Are there better strategies to do this? That is the only strategy that would give us an edge." Firentis shook his head and a sense of regret was seen in his eyes. "As they are now, our forces are just too small." "Is that so?" Kant narrowed his eyes on the man before him. His expression looked rather hazy. Firentis was right. The force at their disposal was too small. If that were the case, the 200 Swadian peasants could not be considered troops. The only reliable ones he had were the 25 Swadian footmen and 70 Swadian militia members. Those were the ones who served as his main forces. They were able to withstand charges from the Jack Allens while also retaliating with ample force. It always seemed to come down to one thing. If Kant had 100 Swadian knights at his disposal, he would have no need to worry about any of that. He grew increasingly frustrated just thinking about the size of his fighting force. "It seems like I'll need to delay the main quest for now." Kant breathed a heavy sigh and regained his composure. He had delayed the first main quest he was given, build a village, for 16 years before finally heading to the desert to make it happen. The current main quest was undoubtedly one of far greater difficulty. His wanting to finish that main quest with the number of troops he currently had was nothing more than a pipe dream. Even if he had the 3 volleys from the 500 Viegir marksmen, which was the formidable trump card that would have made completing the main quest even remotely possible, the chances of completing the quest remained low. That was entirely due to the abhorrently small fighting force he had at his disposal. When one was not in one's best state, the best course of action was to bear with it. That was the standard rule that nobles lived by. However, Kant still narrowed his gaze as he read the introduction from the system. He felt vexed about it all. He did not want to just give up like that. In a severe tone, Kant said, "Firentis." His eyes looked gloomy. "Yes, my lord," Firentis replied. "If we had the troops fight to the death in the battle, would we stand a chance of crushing the Jack Allens?" As he spoke, Kant's tone was extremely serious. Firentis' expression was one of slight shock, but he still nodded affirmatively and said, "We would." Swadian footmen were considered true regular troops. Those units were clad in iron equipment from top to bottom, which consisted of mail armor and iron helmets. They were also armed with heater shields, long swords, and heavy spears. Even back in the Dukedom of Leo, that equipment was reserved only for elite infantry. All of that, coupled with the footmen's formidable combat prowess, would have enabled them to take down the primitive Jack Allans. He was planning on having the footmen as shock troops. The militia member would have been in the middle while the peasants brought up the rear. Putting their all into boosting damage potential, trading for a decisive, formidable charge with heavy casualties on Kant's forces was practically a suicide mission without any hope of coming back alive. Yet, doing easily enabled them to kill at least 500 Jack Allans. There was no doubt about that. All right. Kant took a deep breath. He clenched his fists slightly tighter. He turned around to look at Firentis' severe expression and slowly said, "If I want to attain eventual peace and development, it can only by us annihilating that Jack Allan tribe. Otherwise, what we have now is but a fleeting mirage." Eternal peace was about as pretentious as it could have gotten. Firentis nodded and said in a solemn tone, "I understand, Lord Kant. I hope this won't clash with your ideals." Kant extremely valued Firentis and his hard-earned abilities. One of the last things Kant wanted was for Firentis, who was top-notch and formidable general material, to leave because of one battle. "It won't," Firentis said as he shook his head. He paused for a bit before saying, "What we would be doing would be for securing our future and peace. We won't be able to attain a good life by having mercy on our enemies. That is even more so given that it's the brutal Jack Allans we're talking about here. A knight shouldn't be showing creatures like that any mercy." "Very well." A slight grin finally appeared on Kant's face. That was at least a decent piece of news. Kant's plans included molding Firentis to be the supreme general of his Swadian forces from then on out. The decision was made. Kant and Firentis immediately returned to the council hall to lay out the new strategies. Even if it were to be a suicide run that ended with all of his forces dead, Kant was determined to chew up that first formidable enemy of his whole. Furthermore, he wanted the victory to be a brilliant, decisive one. The entire Oasis lookout seemed to have noticed the warring atmosphere permeating the place. Everyone's expressions turned increasingly serious. With the exception of the builders making noise from the construction happening from day to night, everyone else in the entire Oasis lookout seemed to be silent. Everyone was busy with their own tasks or staying vigilant at their posts. There was no mistaking what was about to happen. A new battle was about to begin. The sky gradually darkened, and the scorching heat finally began to cool. Kant was in the council hall. White candles were lit and placed on the table. They emitted bits of light that illuminated the place. A parchment was laid out on the table. It had messy pencil marks all over it. The lines were crooked, which made the parchment look more like the product of a child doodling. However, both Kant and Firentis looked at the messy lines on the parchment with increasingly solemn expressions. They were looking at a map. It was a map drawn according to Kant's memory from when he and the desert bandits went out to scout the Jack Allan tribe weeks ago. He had completed the basic preparation regarding the upcoming strategy. It was also imperative that simulations were run using the map before eventually starting a new battle. Without proper planning, it left them with no contingency plans or backups should any unexpected circumstances take place, such as failing to strike hard enough to throw the enemy into disarray. If that happened, it meant throwing his forces into chaos instead of the enemy. As such, it was a crucial job that even the dumbest of commanders would not have skipped doing. Time gradually passed. The moon was hanging high in the air. Brilliant stars dotted the skyline. After meticulous discussions were carried out in the council hall, the strategy was finally set. "It's now settled." Kant nodded slowly, showing approval of the strategy that had been decided upon. It was also something that both men had spent the whole day concocting. It was a strategy that gave them the greatest advantage. "We'll strike before dawn. At that time, they will be in the most relaxed state." Firentis nodded as he added about the strategy, "It is a time when even the sentries would have felt drowsy, assuming that the Jack Allan tribe had them in the first place." It would be the best time to ambush them. It would indeed. Kant nodded. Firentis said, I will lead 17 of the elite desert bandits and charge right into the center of the tribe to locate the huge tent, where the Jack Allen shaman will likely be, in the shortest amount of time. We will then take out the shaman. The tribe, which would have just lost its chieftain, will be thrown into complete chaos due to not having any command of any sort. After that, it will be up to you, Lord Kant. Rest assured. I will lead the troops to scatter and immediately take care of any resisting Jack Allens we encounter. As his eyes narrowed, Kant's gaze looked rather dangerous. Even if they are somehow able to organize a resistance, 3 volleys of arrows will crush them all the same. Firentis nodded with a serious expression. Enemies thrown into disarray are no longer enemies. The 3 things that needed to happen included the Jack Allens losing command, being thrown into chaos, and scattering. If all 3 states were imposed upon the Jack Allen tribe, it almost guaranteed victory for Kant's forces. Then again, it was certain that they would also have casualties. The loss of lives was likely going to be severe. There was nothing neither men were able to do about that. People died in wars. In its essence, fighting battles was an act of spilling blood and extinguishing lives. Be it the enemy or his people, bodies were going to be left strewn all over the place one way or another. To finally secure a future for us, I would have no problem seeing my entire force wiped out as long as that Jack Allen tribe is completely crushed. He let out a long and hard exhale as he muttered to himself. Kant had never considered himself to be a decent man. Although he was known to be diligent and studious back in the dukedom of Leo, he, as someone of noble birth who had lived 2 lives, was bound to be a selfing person. I will recruit some new blood for fighting this battle. Kant looked at Firentis and slowly said, recruits will at least be able to fight better than peasants. That should be the way. Firentis nodded. Kant was allowed to recruit troops every week, which meant converting Swadian peasants into Swadian recruits. The rule that allowed recruiting only 1 unit per week, like how it was with the desert bandit lair, did not apply in this regard. There was no limit to the number of Swadian recruits that could be recruited. It was a random thing that was completely up to the system.